Hello class, welcome to the week 5 unit, and in this unit we're going to take a look at how we can actually put multiple different values or multiple different entries into a single variable. So up until this point, when we've been working with a variable, we've been working with a variable that's been holding on to just one value, whether that's a number, a boolean, or whatever it might be. In this weekly unit, we're going to explore how we can actually put multiple values into a single variable. And this is going to be a tool that is especially powerful and especially useful because if you think about, say, something like a model grid for, say, a numerical model, which might have millions of different points in it, it would be extremely tedious and very painful to create an individual variable for each one of those grid points, each value for that grid point. So if we could just have all that information be in a single variable that we can just reference, then that would definitely be preferable to manually creating a variable for, say, a million or even a billion different grid points. And there are data sets out there that have a billion different entries in them. So that's where the idea of a Python list and also something called a NumPy array, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the class. But for now, just to sort of get an initial bearing, let's focus on the idea of a Python list. And here we have on the screen an example of such a list. So that's declared here on line 2. So in this case, just like any other variable, we have the variable name on the left-hand side, the equal sign, and then what we want to go in the variable goes on the right-hand side. So this actually kind of also goes back to what we were talking about when we were talking about parentheses in the math, how we mentioned the brackets and braces have their own functionality that is not math related. And now we're going to actually take a look at that functionality, brackets being something to start with, and the braces will actually cover at the very end. But this is how you would declare a list in Python. So you have your variable name, equal sign, and then on the right-hand side, that's where you would put the value you want to go in your variable, in this case, a list of numbers, which are the first few digits in the number pi. And the way that you signify that this is a list is you use just a set of brackets here. So open bracket, close bracket. And then each individual entry in the list is separated by a comma. So here we have the commas that separate the individual entries in the list. So this would be the first entry in our list, the second entry in our list, the third entry, the third entry in our list, the fourth entry, and then so on and so forth. So now that we have all that information in our variable, which we're calling myList, and there's nothing special about this name that I have here, this can be any valid variable name at all. Just make sure you're consistent about it. So now that might then raise the question, how exactly do we access the information that is contained within the list of numbers that we put on the screen here? And that's where we get into what's on line 4. So in this case, we have a variable called myList. So you can see if I want to access an individual entry in the list, and I need to specify which variable that goes to, or which list I'm wanting to pull the information out of. Because in a more complicated Python program, you might have multiple different lists going on. They each have to have their own variable name in order for the computer to actually do something. So whichever list you want to pull the particular entry out of, you would type out the name of that list, and then you would have a set of brackets, and then here you put a number inside the brackets, and that number essentially tells the computer what value, or and as we'll see later on, what values you want to pull out of the list, and whatever in this case we're just simply printing out what that value is, but we could also do some sort of math with that entry or something else. And something that we should point out right away is, earlier I said that this was this is the first entry in the list, this 3 that I have highlighted here. But it turns out that the computer does not start counting at 1. In fact, the computer starts counting at 0. So what we humans would call the first entry in a list, the computer is actually going to call that entry number 0, or the 0th entry in a list of numbers. And what we would call the second entry in the list, it would call entry number 1. And what we would call the third entry in the list, the computer will call entry number 2. So that's just something that you'll have to keep in mind as you're working through Python lists, and that's something that's very important to keep in mind. Otherwise, you're going to be pretty heavily confused if you're not aware of that difference between how the human will read this and how the computer will read this. So by putting the 0 in the brackets here, that means I want entry number 0, which to the computer is going to be this 3, again, what we humans would call the first entry of the list. The computer is called the 0th entry in the list. So by putting the 0 in the brackets here, then we tell the computer that we want it to pull out entry number 0, or the very first item in the list, which in this case would be the number 3. And here we're pulling that entry out and just simply telling the computer to print out that entry that we pull out of the list and just simply print that over into the console. So if we want to demonstrate that, we can just simply go ahead and run the program. And you can see when we tell this program to run, it does in fact print out the number 3, which again, we get from here, telling the computer to pull the 0th entry out of a list called myList. And the 0th entry, what we humans would call the very first entry, is in fact the number 3. So that does in fact match up with what we would expect. Now let's take a look at some other examples of this idea of pulling information out of a list of numbers. So let's see what happens if we put a 4 in the bracket. So if this is the 0th item in the list according to the computer, then just counting up by 1 going down the line, we would get this to be item number 1, item number 2 in the list, item number 3, and this 5 here would be item number 4. So if we were to tell the computer to access item number 4 in our list called myList and print out what that entry is, we would expect the computer to pull this 5 out of our list of numbers and then print that 5 out to the screen here, just like it did the 3. And if we want to confirm that result, we can in fact run the program and see it does in fact print out a 5 here. Now something that's something that's kind of special about Python, pardon that little voice crack, my throat's been kind of clogged these past several days for some weird reason. Excuse me. So something that's kind of special to Python is you can actually put a negative number in the brackets here when you're telling the computer to pull an entry out of the list. And it turns out if you put a -1 in the brackets here, that tells the computer to pull out the final entry or the last entry in myList. And if you were to put a -2 in here, something that we'll demonstrate right after this, that means pull out the second to last entry in the list that's specified, in this case myList. And if you put a -3 in here, then that means pull out the third to last entry out of the list. So for any number negative in these brackets, just to sort of generalize the pattern, for any number negative in, that means pull out the nth to last entry inside the list in question. So in this case, here our number in the brackets is -1, which means pull out the first to last item, which is just simply the last item, which would be this 5. And then as you'll see down here, we'll demonstrate what happens when you put -2 in here. That means pull out the second to last entry in myList, which would be the 6 here. So if we first want to confirm the result we get on line 6 here, putting a -1 inside the brackets, we would expect it to pull this 5, which is the very last entry in myList, and print that 5 out to the screen. You can see running that program, we do in fact get the 5 here. And if I want to, I can change this to something else just to sort of prove that this 5 is not the same thing as the 5 that we got up here. So now I change the final entry in the list to be an 8. And if that is in fact pulling out the final entry, you can see now I do in fact get the 8, which is in fact the final entry or the last entry in myList. And if we want to demonstrate that with a -2, which means pull out the second to last item, so counting from the edge here, this would be the last item, this would be the second to last item, so the computer should access the 6 and print that information out to the console, since that's what we're telling it to do. This right here that we have highlighted, that's just the process of accessing the individual item, and since that's contained within the print statement, that means we're going to be printing out the item that we access there and printing that information to the console. And we can in fact confirm this is pulling out the second to last entry in myList and printing that information to the console. So, as we've been going through this, you might be wondering what happens if you put in a number that's really big or something that's really small. If we take a look at the list here, we can just sort of highlight how the computer is going to read this off. So this is item number 0, item number 1, item number 2, item number 3, item number 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So the highest value we can put in the brackets for this particular list is 8. Since that's starting from 0 and counting up by 1 for each entry, we get 8 being the very last entry. So that might then raise the question, what happens if you try putting a 10 in the brackets here? So since there is no item number 10 in my list, this is actually going to produce an error message. And this is probably going to be an error message that you encounter a lot, even when you get a lot of experiences a lot of experience with lists and the related data types, you're probably going to see this error message a lot or something similar to this. This is something that even I have seen a lot, even with all the experience I have working with data sets. And you'll see this message saying list index out of range, which if you see this, it means that you put a number in the brackets here that was too large, or you could also put a number that's too negative in here. So here I'm going to say pull out the 10th to last item in my list, and if you count from right to left, you will find that no such item exists, and you will get the same exact error message, list index out of range. And something else that we'll demonstrate a little bit later on is you can put variables in the brackets here, and that's something we'll look at a little bit later on in greater detail. But if I want to, I could do something like, so here I'll use the variable I, and I'll say I equals 2, just a nice simple number. And then I could do something like this, myList I in the brackets. And if I do that, then what it's going to do is it's going to look up what the value of I is at this point in the program, get a number from that or get a value from that. So, and we can see I is equal to 2. So in essence, the computer is just going to take the value of I, which is 2, plug that 2 into the brackets, and then everything from there functions normally. So that would be pulling out 0, 1, item number 2, which would be this 4 that is highlighted up here, and we can in fact confirm this works. Now, the main restriction that you want to keep in mind when you're working with variables and plugging numbers into the brackets, we've already talked about one restriction, and that's you can't put a number that's too large or too negative, but you also can't put anything that's not an integer in there. So you must put an integer in the brackets, or the end result must be an integer in the brackets. If you try something like 2.75, that'd be like asking what's item number 2.75 out on your grocery list, and you'd probably say, what the heck? What are you even asking for? The computer's going to give you a similar response. But it's going to be in its own weird language. List indices must be integers or slices, not float, which is a really odd way of saying that you put a value that wasn't an integer inside the brackets here. So that's just something to keep in mind. When you're pulling information out of the list, make sure that the end result in this brackets is an integer, and also make sure that integer is not too large or too small. Well, that's going to do it for this first segment on lists. And in the next segment, we're going to talk about sort of a special function that you can use on lists and some other data types that we cover during the course of this weekly unit. So with that, I will see you all in the next segment.